All right, hello everyone and welcome. I am Brooke Wilson. My preferred pronouns are she and her. I am an April board member and the facilitator of the call today. Thank you for joining us for this workshop, Keeping It Real, Positive, Effective, and Authentic SILC Member Engagement. I want to mention a few housekeeping items before we get started today. First, when you scroll over the screen, a menu bar pops up. Depending on what device you are on, you can find that menu bar at the top or at the bottom of the screen. That is where you will find the closed captioning for today's session. You can view the captioning by selecting the CC tab on the menu bar. For sign language interpreting, you can find the interpreter also on the screen. If you would like to change the size of the screen, if the slides are shown, you can select a line that appears in the middle when you hover over and drag it to the left or the right to make the slides larger or smaller and the interpreter larger or smaller. If you have technical issues, please use the chat feature. You can find the word bubble in that same menu bar. If you would like to turn off the chat feature, if you're using a screen reader, you can do that by pressing Alt-H. For Q&A times, please note the Q&A box on the menu bar, and please only submit questions there as they may get lost in the chat. To ask a question or make a comment, you can also select the hand option on the menu bar. That allows us to know that you have a question. For those of you on the phone today or using keystrokes, we ask that you press *9 or Alt-Y on your keypad to raise your hand. We will then let you know when you can unmute. You can select the unmute option or Alt-A if using keystrokes. Please remember, if you join into the conversation, to keep all your background noise down as much as possible to allow us to hear you clearly. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenter, Matt.
Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Inyart. My pronouns are he and his. I am with the Kansas Institute for Positive, Healthy, Inclusive Communities, which I realize is a mouthful. And so the session today, we're going to be talking about keeping it real, positive, effective, and authentic SILC member engagement. So I have a few challenges today to pull off this presentation. For one is, what does keeping it real even mean? So I have to describe that. Even writing it for the proposal, it felt a little gimmicky, like the flavor of the month, like something that somebody's trying to pitch. So I have to convince you otherwise. I have an hour to do it in. And I said that I'd provide you with some practical tips. So I have to think about what I can provide you that's practical within an hour, really describe the importance of this, of these authentic engagement practices, and get through it. So these are my challenges. I'm up for it, but it is going to involve your participation. So throughout this presentation, I'll be asking for you to help me with some of the activities. That will help you and others on the call get a better understanding of activities that you could actually do within your own SILC. So a little bit about my background. So just so you know that I'm not just making this up, this does come from a base of research and work that I've done over the last 10 plus years with teams, networks, different types of human service organizations within different states and even with another country. And within this work that I did with other researchers, with other human service providers, we continually found the same thing over and over. We were going in to do system change. We were going in to work with human service systems to improve them. And we kept finding these same patterns. Essentially that organizations or networks like SILCs, like organization leadership teams, were getting stuck admiring problems. And what I mean by that is stuck just talking about what was wrong instead of being solution focused and trying to fix it. The other occurrence that kept coming up was that people or organizations or systems didn't have trouble finding research-based or evidence-based practices, or reading a book about what should work, or attending even a 1-hour session at a conference about what things they could do. But despite the information they would get, it just wouldn't sustain, it didn't stick. So that was another continual theme that kept coming up. The other one, and this one's heartbreaking for me. I worked with in human services with individuals with disabilities. I started out working for an IDD or intellectual and developmental disability provider when I was 18. But many of these organizations within their boards, within their leadership teams, within their state networks, within their SILCs, they'd lost the emphasis on the person served. They'd lost the spirit of the actual law. So when you think about things like the home and community-based service waivers, when you think about the legislation and the advocacy that's even before the legislation that went into the independent living movement, when we think about that, once, here we are 20, 30, 40 years later, and a lot of those that legislation and related policy has lost the emphasis or the spirit of the reason it was formed, which is the individual. And we've been more caught up on oversight and procedure instead of really looking out for what's best and how do we promote quality of life with persons served. So the last theme that kept coming up, and this one's what I'm going to be talking about today, the critical piece that was occurring, or I should say not occurring, in organizations and networks like SILCs was that they were not effectively teaming. They were not using positive, effective teaming practices. They didn't know how to work together. They didn't know how to problem solve. It was throwing a group of people together, but they didn't know how to be effective in achieving goals. They didn't know what to do when they had challenges or conflicting interests. So oftentimes the reason for this is because within an organization, people are promoted not always based on their ability to nurture or collaborate. They're often promoted based on seniority, or they just are, or their skills in working with people. Then they're not intentionally taught the other skills they need around teaming. Even more challenging are organizations or networks like SILCs, where individuals are not even within the same organization, they're stakeholders that are put together that are not intentionally taught those skills. And around that, those specific things within that teaming that was missing was absence of leadership skills, absence of just, what does it mean to have good relationships on a team? How do you engage with a stakeholder in a healthy, constructive manner? And what I mean by that is people on your team and around the team. And then how do you continue to build those networks up so that you can sustain them? And then also, how do you address the issue of who is on your team and what your team, the membership that you have, the composition of your team, and making sure that it's healthy and balanced, and people are there that can help you achieve your mission. So all of these pieces came up within that last bullet of trends that we found over 10+ years of work with teams. What I'm excited to share with you is that by specifically addressing these needs, by doing so intentionally and authentically, we can make a big difference. We can reverse the course of this work, of the research trends I just identified. So the good news side of what I'm here to share today is, just as the work has gone in to identify what the challenges are, work has also gone in to identify what are the effective features of a team. And there's a picture, an image here of a stool, a three-legged stool, a wooden stool. And each of the three legs has a word upon it. The first leg has the word systems. The second leg has the word practices. And the third leg has the word data. And to speak to the stool, the reason I use this picture to describe what I'm about to go into more detail on is, if you imagine yourself sitting on a stool that has 3 legs. It requires balance. All 3 legs need to be stable, sturdy, and equal in length to be able to sit comfortably and to be balanced upon the stool. So sitting upon this stool, you need to continually, in an organization or in a team, pay attention to what systems are occurring. And systems include things like what type of communication is happening, what do your bylaws look like, what types of oversight systems do you have in place, what kinds of practices, how are practices monitored. Then practices, if we look at the practices leg, that is just how do we engage every day? How are we engaging with our team, with our fellow SILC members to achieve our goals? And then the third leg of the stool, the data, is really about how do we evaluate that? How do we evaluate how we're doing and ensure that we're making sure that we're addressing, that we have the systems and practices in place we need to be successful. Now, atop that stool in this graphic, I have a triangle. And some of you might be familiar with this triangle. It reflects a continuum of support or a multi-tiered system of support. And at the base of the triangle is the color green. And it goes about 2/3 of the way up. Above that is the color yellow. And that goes just a bit further up. And at the tip top of the triangle is the color red. Now, the green layer at the base of the triangle reflects prevention and consistency in what we need to do in a community around systems and practices and evaluation to ensure that we're meeting the needs of the individuals in our community, our beneficiaries, for example, with SILC, persons with disabilities, but also considering who else is on the team and that their needs are being met. The yellow area of the triangle represents those that are at risk or that might need additional monitoring and support. Again, it's still focused on prevention, but identifying if people need some additional things to ensure that they're healthy and they're safe and they're getting their needs met. And then the tip top, that red part, is when we need to sometimes provide intensive supports, or we have to intervene in a way that is more direct and put something in place that's more intensive. But that triangle in this example for what we're going to talk about today really reflects that we know that teams through our work need to have a lens that reflects a continuum of support. And they need to think about that when they work with their SILC members and also when they think about persons served. And then they also need to think about always sitting on that stool and having things change around systems, practices, and evaluation. And forever you're trying to adjust and balance your stool. So you always need to keep those things in mind. So to take a look again at the slide and what we have written here, these are some specific things that relate to how do we better improve SILCs across the country, SILCs within each state. How do we improve this teaming aspect that we know can be challenging, this engagement factor that we know can be challenging? Well, if we use the stool graphic and consider that continuum lens, we first can think about the systems part and how it relates to the SILC. SILCs need to have a clear mission and clear expectations of their members and clear expectations of their collective purpose. Clear expectations around their collective purpose, and again, for each of the members. Within the SILC, we need to have good communication and trust. We need to make sure that we have consistent communication and that there's trust amongst members and with SILC staff, but also with stakeholders. Those things are all critical to a SILC operation. When we think about the practices leg, that's really about collaboration and conflict resolution. And if you think about it, within organizations that we've all worked, human service organizations, How often are we really trained on the nuts and bolts, the things that you need every day, on how to just work well with your colleagues, how to work well with your coworkers, how to resolve a conflict, how to be effective in working towards a common goal? Those are things that often aren't even taught within organizations. And of course they get missed in entities like SILCs. The other important piece around practices is positive culture and strengths-based strategies. So you heard me already mention the admiring of problems. It's really easy to get stuck on the negativity of the things that don't work or the things you can't do. And so we know that we can have a huge impact on the output and the effectiveness of SILCs and other types of groups if we can shift that to a positive culture and be strengths-based and be strengths-focused in our strategies and just in the way that we talk. Lastly, when you're thinking about that last leg of the stool, you have to have ongoing evaluation. You can't bring people in, for example, for a workshop, let alone for an hour at a conference and have that fix everything. You have to have a plan to intentionally install those systems and practices that I just mentioned, and then a way to monitor that, because guess what? Things are going to change. New people are going to come on the SILC, are going to become members. State leadership is going to change. Funding entities are going to change. So you have to be prepared to change with it. And so that requires ongoing evaluation. I realize I'm talking quickly and I've said a lot, but we're going to work through each of these pieces. And I hope that you'll join me as we talk together through some of the different activities that you can do to get started with your SILC, some of the conversations that could better engage members. And a lot of it really does start with keeping it real. And so that's not just a catchy title. This is one of the biggest pieces that we saw coming up with different types of organizations. When we had leaders come sit around a table and everybody just nodded and had their arms crossed and took care of their business, but didn't really talk about what the challenges were, didn't really talk about what was working, what wasn't working, what the needs were, just kind of showed up and did their job to get through the day. Those were the teams and organizations that struggled with achieving effective outcomes with striving. And so the same is true for SILCs. And it's even more difficult because people are from all different types of organizations representing different viewpoints. So we have to make sure that we keep it real. And guess what? Keeping it real takes practice. Keeping it real can be very uncomfortable. Most things worth doing take practice and are uncomfortable. And that's a big part of what my work is about, is helping individuals, helping organizations, helping networks work through this process. But organizations, SILCs like yours, can do some things to work towards that yourself. So in the images here, we've got a project that I've been working on that's actually related to this, called Positive Effective Teaming. So on the left side of the screen is an image with myself sitting at a coffee shop at a table with my laptop taking notes. And I'm sitting with a SILC member from Oregon. And we are having a discussion about strengths and challenges that are occurring within that individual SILC, discussing what's going well, what types of opportunities are present. The reason we take the time to do that, and the reason I'm going to do an activity with you is because in the graphic to the right actually is just a generic bar graph. And the reason I have that in there is to remind me and to remind you how important data is. Data is critical to our understanding of what's happening. And it's also critical to us making progress and sustaining progress. And I know some people, when they think of data, they immediately think of somebody in a lab coat, standing around, taking notes, writing down jargon that nobody's going to understand. Or if anybody's worked in administration, when you think of data, you think of oversight entities asking, sometimes demanding, data that you have no idea how it's used, and it does not necessarily help you. And it's kind of a pain to collect. So many times that's what we think of when we think of data. Data comes in many forms. It can be information like I'm collecting here in this image. It can also be in the form of surveys. It can be in the form of hard numbers, outcomes related to what your SILC is working towards. But it's really important that you have data that you're collecting that is good data, that's meaningful to you, that's data that can help you, that's data that can help you inform your decisions, both with regard to how you work together as a SILC, but also how you achieve your goals as a SILC, and how you achieve your goals in collaboration with your stakeholders. Data is absolutely critical, but the right kind of data. And I have a quote here, and this comes from another work that I did, but we will continue to admire a problem until its origin and function are understood and addressed, which means it's just, again, the research, my own work with organizations, systems, networks, councils like SILCs, is problems can sit and cycle and cycle and cycle forever. The only way to stop that is to get at its actual origin and to understand its function, and then actually intervene. And again, that's where that keeping it real and discomfort comes in. But there is a pathway forward. So we're going to ask some questions. I'm going to ask some questions, I should say, of those that are on the call. And I hope that you'll participate, because again, this will help your fellow, your colleagues that are also on the call. And it will help me be able to better show the benefit of these activities, even if they seem a little easy. I promise that I'm going to get to my point. So who on the call can share with me their mission, their SILC mission, and also maybe some expectations related to your SILC for SILC members, some SILC member expectations. Anybody?
And just as a reminder, you can press *9 or select the raise hand to join into the conversation, and I can allow you to unmute, or you can drop it into the chat.
Thank you.
Okay. Jake, you can go ahead and unmute.
I actually had to look this up on the SILC website for Montana, and one of the main goals is to improve transportation, and because Montana, despite its size, it's wildly uncultivated. A lot of it is backwoods or forests, and people are really spread out. So if we can improve transportation, we can better serve our consumers.
That's great. That's great. Thanks for sharing, Jake. So Jake, are you a SILC member in Montana? Are you on the SILC?
I'm not on the SILC, but I do work at an independent living center.
Okay. Well, great. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, transportation, that's an important, that's a part of many states' mission. Definitely here in Kansas, we deal with some of the rural challenges, not like Montana though. I've been to Montana and not like Oregon. So definitely some additional challenges there. But yes, that's a great example. Anybody else have any thoughts on your mission or kind of expectations you have of your SILC or SILC members?
So there is a mission in the Q&A. Would you like me to read it?
That'd be fantastic.
So Kathy Cooper listed the mission as promoting integration and full inclusion of Kansans with disabilities into mainstream of society.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Kathy, for sharing that. So when we think about our mission, is there anybody else that would like to share before I move on and kind of expand on this? Okay, I'm going to proceed forward. So Kathy, that was a quality mission and very detailed. The example that we heard about Montana, that was a specific kind of like a goal, probably of a work group within Montana. I imagine that's working towards those transportation goals. So SILCs have a lot of responsibility with regard to the state plan for independent living. They also collaborate with these work groups to achieve these other kind of goals that are related. So when we think about that, that's a lot of moving parts. And there's a lot of individuals that are in those groups or in those work groups that don't necessarily work together all the time. So when we think about the mission, the one, like for example, the one that Kathy shared, how do we train people, train SILC members on first the mission and on what they need to be doing to help carry out that mission? So what are some specific things that SILCs do when they bring on a SILC member or on an ongoing basis to ensure that the mission or those goals, for example, in Montana, are achieved by SILC members? So what are some things that SILCs do? Kathy, if you're still on, tell me what we do in Kansas to help make sure that members kind of have a handle on the mission and how you help members have the skills to achieve that mission.
So her response is board orientation, history, explain SILC's role versus SIL role.
Okay, so board orientation. Okay, so clarification regarding the role of the SILC. Okay, the role of SILC. Also clarifying what the SILs do, what the SILC does. So talking about specific expectations. It's really important that we do more than just talk about those things. And so even in full disclosure, so I am from Kansas, and did serve 6 years on the Kansas SILC with Kathy. So, but even with our work in Kansas, we could improve on how we actually train board members, how we onboard them, how we onboard SILC members, how we engage with stakeholders around those expectations, around how we achieve that mission. My point is, we cannot just assume that people have that because they read an orientation manual or because they had an hour orientation. We've got to think about ways to better engage individuals. We also have to shift the conversation always to who the SILC and the SPIL benefit. And so we always have to make sure we're shifting that back to who do they benefit. And then also, when you're thinking about your composition of your SILC, and when you're thinking about involving individuals in work groups, you have to think about who would be an ideal member, who's already present, and who's missing. So can somebody share with me some ideal qualities of a SILC member?
And again, you can drop them in the chat, the Q&A, you can raise your hand. So we have a few coming up in the chat. A person with a disability, hopefully. Someone who has knowledge of SILs and what they do. And then we do have an attendee with their hand raised.
One of the early answers, someone who is disabled and someone who is very up to date and current with the statewide issues that affect people with disabilities.
Good, good. So I heard 3 great answers, and let me repeat those to make sure I capture them all. So individuals that reflect the beneficiaries of independent living services, so persons with disabilities, individuals that are up to date on kind of current issues in the state that are related to disability, and then individuals that know how SILs work, so Centers for Independent Living. So I would say that that's probably typically what people look for when they're looking at making recommendations. The issue is often, and not all SILCs, but often individuals are recruited or asked to join the SILC or engage in a work group because they have that background, but there's not additional work that goes into how individuals can work together to achieve those goals. How do they collaborate and actually work together? So, and the same thing is true. So you just described specific SILC member characteristics you would like to see. But the same is true of overall composition. And I know there's guidelines with regard to and requirements with regard to SILC composition, but you really want to think about who's missing on your SILC and how do you build that. You have to be, you're very intentional in who you bring onto the SILC and what your overall composition is. But where we miss sometimes is about the actual expectations of SILC members and what skills they might need to be successful in achieving that mission and vision that we first talked about, that transportation goal that we discussed in Montana, and as is in many states. So we want to really think about what are the expectations of SILC members. So Kathy mentioned board orientation. So what kind of things do you talk about in board orientation, and others can jump in, that you go over with your SILC members?
There were a couple other potential, so someone said advocacy. We need members with advocacy and we'll look forward to solving problems. And someone added individuals who represent other disability organizations, someone with connections to the legislature, representatives from SILs, and people willing to advocate for disability rights.
Okay, yes, those are also good qualities. However, that just helped me like shift or transition a little bit. Because when you think about advocacy, and the SILCs have a role in advocacy now, but we also SILCs have to make sure that they're on the same page with regard to advocacy, and make sure that within the SILC itself, that they know what they can and how they can advocate. But at the same time, SILC members and SILC stakeholders may actively be engaging in advocacy on their own, representing their organizations or themselves. So this advocacy is a perfect example of something that can come up that can cause some of those challenges that can lead to problems we admire or conflicts between SILC membership. So we have to be very intentional SILCs have to be very intentional along with other teams in looking at their mission and expectations and thinking about those potential challenges that could come up to make sure that they're addressed so that their expectations are clear from the beginning. They also need to be very intentional in exercises to build that communication and that trust. And that starts with building bylaws, building any type of expectations, any types of procedures in an open manner. And I know that that's the way it's supposed to occur, but often it doesn't always feel that way to everybody involved in a SILC and also from a stakeholder standpoint. So the more transparent you can be, the more you can intentionally work on those communication skills, the better your systems work. And it's more the better chance that you're going to actually achieve your desired mission, vision, and related goals. And this clear mission expectations, this communication and trust should be reflected throughout the leadership, throughout bylaws, recruitment strategies, and the onboarding and orientation. And when I say reflected in leadership, it should be modeled in leadership. So everything making sure that we're upfront around those expectations. Was there a question?
There's a couple comments that I think tie in well here. So Jake said, I'm only speculating, but I would think code of conduct would arise since you are repping a state organization. And then Lori said, outreach to building networking, that working with local government, mentorship between experienced SILC members partnered up with new SILC members to understand that bylaws, legislative, household rules at meetings, and understand the different bias versus legislature agenda.
Yes. Yeah, so code of conduct, code of ethics, understanding legislation, the related guidelines, all critical things. The point I'm really trying to make today is in addition to those things, and the mentorship is a great tool to make sure that as board members come on, that they're connected with somebody else so they can kind of get a lay of the land. So that's a great way to do it. But the difference between talking about those things and providing bylaws and the legislation and sending somebody a PDF or handing them a thick notebook to go over, and them actually wrapping their head around it are two different things, especially when there's conflicts or misunderstandings between those things. And on the slide, I have a bunch of Legos, a visual of a bunch of Legos in the corner. And the reason I have Legos in describing these pieces is because there's more than one way to build your SILC or organizations, but there's a lot of parts, and you want to make sure that you carefully, intentionally put those together for your organization, and you want to make sure that it's done collectively, intentionally, and that everybody can see it and that you're on the same page. And again, that just like when we talked about the stool, that's going to change. So there's moving parts. So you have to have a lot of check-ins. You can't make assumptions about everyone being aware of those code of conduct, code of ethics. You need to make sure you review those things regularly and revisit them. Because as we jumped ahead with the advocacy piece, but can somebody give me an example of when SILC members might have, so give me an example of a shared interest that SILC members would have, which there's some obvious ones. And then give me an example of potentially a competing interest that SILC members or stakeholders might have. Can somebody give me an example of each? Anybody? So I'll start off with shared interest is easy, right? We're all, when you join the SILC, like we talked about the common mission, those goals, individuals that join or get involved with the stakeholder group or individuals, those individuals are interested in that mission and vision. They're interested in improving supports and services, improving quality of life of beneficiaries. But what are some examples of competing interests?
So it took a minute for them to type out their answers. So
Okay.
shared interests, people with disabilities living independently, and increase of employment opportunities versus more affordable housing.
Great.
This would be their shared interest.
Yep.
We have a competing interest, focusing on a pet resource they want to build for their local community.
Okay. So interested in something that would benefit their local community, but that may not be something that has a statewide application. Okay, yeah, that's a common one. And there's a reason for that, right? Is it Jake Jake from Montana? So Jake from Montana is, are all your communities the same in Montana?
They're not all the same. For instance, Kalispell is more residential and business. Though there are businesses, but as for Whitefish, they've kind of cut down their interest in affordable housing, and instead they're focusing on making more businesses so that there are more job opportunities. But it's at the expense of affordable housing.
That's excellent. Thank you for sharing those details and the differences between your community. Who is the SILC meant to? Who's the SILC for? Who's the SILC serve? Is it one community or most communities? Who's the SILC supposed to serve?
What's the acronym SILC stand for? Statewide.
Thank you, Brooke. So statewide. And so, however, you cannot, by nature of what you're trying to accomplish with the state plan for independent living in a statewide council, it is impossible for you not to have competing interests that are going to come up, just like the one we described, just like Jake's example. It's also, there's going to be competing interests because people come from different types of organizations. And so, for example, what might be in the interest of one SIL may not be in the interest of another SIL, Center for Independent Living. What is in the interest of vocational rehab services may not be in the interest of every SIL or related organization because of another type of project that they're working on. Things are just going to come up. So these issues are going to happen. Potential misunderstandings are going to happen. Potentially some of these misunderstandings can be long-standing and can actually get in the way of fully operating to achieve your vision and mission to ensure that you're meeting all those needs statewide. It's very important when you're thinking about that statewide aspect, that so even in the way that comment was made that some people have pet projects, I would challenge everyone to reframe a little bit and maybe think about things in more of an equity manner instead of an equal manner. So when we think about serving the entire state, that doesn't mean that everybody gets the same. What that means is that we meet the needs of everyone in the state, and all those needs, just like people, are different. So we have to make sure we look through that lens. And that, just what I just shared, is in part what you have to educate your SILC members on. So they're not put at odds with each other, so they understand that that challenge is going to come up and how to learn the skills to address that. So when we're engaging our SILC members, we have to discuss issues of bias, related to geographical issues, race, ethnicity, any bias that might come up. We need to make sure that we get that out in the open. Again, discomfort is absolutely going to be a part of this. We have to, it's uncomfortable to talk about this, but we have to. We need to make sure you emphasize that, you need to make sure to emphasize individual member strengths and collective strengths. You want to make sure that you do intentional training on communication and conflict resolution. And that is not just having somebody come in and talk for an hour and go away. It is actually getting material, practicing, and I'm going to talk about how in a second. And then it's being intentional and doing the activities and getting feedback. And then you don't just do it once. You're continually reminding individuals of those expectations that relate back to the mission. And again, you're practicing, practicing, practicing. The other important part when you think about SILC membership and engaging them is that when something goes maybe awry, when somebody gets off track a little bit. So if Brooke and I had an issue in a meeting and disagreed in front of other folks and had a challenging exchange and we got a little bit off of the mission, our mission, it would be really important for that SILC leadership to come talk to us really quickly, or even happen in real live time, to bring us back to the mission and vision, and reference those expectations and talk about those training points that we'd already gone over. If we've already talked about expectations, built them together, they're easier to reference. If we're regularly reviewing them, they're easier to reference. And it just becomes part of our culture that we do that. And then again, ongoing evaluation and overall booster trainings as needed on these important topics are very critical. So on the intentional training and practice, specifically looking at how do you collaborate effectively? And again, there's all different types of curriculum out there, but what's most important, and this is part of the work that I do, but what's most important is that you find it and that you do something that works for your SILC, and you practice it and you discuss it and you do role playing even to make sure you work through possible scenarios. You are intentional in building a positive culture and talking about your strengths. If there's a tough meeting and people are over focusing just on the challenges, shifting it back. It doesn't mean we ignore challenges. It means that we frame it in a way that we build on our strengths and then we address those challenges. And what's most critical is that your SILC leadership, as new people are coming in, as you're engaging in stakeholders, that one of the number one things you can do to increase the quality of your engagement is that you model these things. You practice what you preach. Whatever expectations you've come up with collectively, if somebody's in a leadership role, they need to be practicing it constantly and giving people feedback as needed, but in a constructive manner so that they're responsive. Now, I know this might seem a little ideal. And again, I remember back to my challenges. How do I cover all this in an hour? I'm just kind of giving you an overview of the work that I know that needs to be done based on the research and the data that's available. And I'm trying to give you some starting places for that. So some concrete things you can do, because again, I know that seems idealistic without, again, being handed a curriculum. Some tricks around like redirection is always making sure, again, to talk about expectations related to persons, the beneficiaries, and making sure that people understand there's that continuum of needs, that keeps equity as the focus, making sure everyone understands everybody needs something different, including SILC members, and bring it back to, again, person served. So when you get off track, you say, okay, we can agree to disagree on this, but let's focus on what's best for the statewide needs of individuals with disabilities. The other piece is, again, staying objective, not taking things personally. And that is only possible, well, it's not only possible, it's way more likely if you've built those shared expectations together, because then it's not personal. You're not getting into a disagreement. Brooke and I, or Kathy or I, are not getting into a disagreement about how to handle something or how to engage with a stakeholder. We simply are referencing the expectations that we built together and realigning with them. And so over time, it becomes much easier to constructively check your colleagues and bring them back to that the more you do it. And if you do so in a constructive, positive way. But it starts with building them and building them and agreeing upon them. So again, activities that you can do. And here's the other thing. I've just said this, but I cannot be more clear that one of the places the breakdown happens is through something called train and hope models. And what I mean by that is watching an hour presentation at a conference, reading a book, bringing somebody in for a 4-hour workshop, and then they leave. Those are rarely successful. What you need to do is you need to work with somebody or on your own, build these expectations, build these strategies, identify those scenarios, and practice them. And yes, I mean, like, in a very corny, goofy way. You have to actually go through and practice those scenarios. And if you're able to practice those scenarios in a lighthearted way, when people are calm and in a good place, and do it enough, then it's way more likely that when a real scenario happens, that people are going to be able to actually do it in real time, do it when it's needed. Or they may need a little bit of coaching, but they'll remember that they'll recall what you practice and be able to be coached back to that, or be reminded of those objectives, expectations that you develop together. So, and you can do that with partners. I've seen that be very successful. And that would add on to some of those mentor discussions or the mentor ideas that we talked about. You can also do it as a full group, as a part of your training. But again, don't make it into just your annual training. This needs to be an ongoing activity. And so I would recommend doing something within every one of your meetings, or setting aside extra time quarterly, or doing it as needed, depending on what your data says. So the data collection, and so essentially what you're doing, again, there's this Lego pieces in the corner of the slide. And I apologize, those last 2 slides I had 2 individuals together working on the partner activity and 3 individuals working on a group activity. I failed to describe those slides, and my apologies.
Just want to let you know we have 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm wrapping up. So on this slide, we're talking about continually shaping your SILC and shaping those relationship with SILC members. And again, I have the Legos in the corner because it is about continually building those Legos, addressing those 3 legs of the stool. So the important ways to go about that, again, I've described the setting the expectations, the practicing the different skills, but a critical piece around the data is finding a way to survey your membership in a way to survey them in an authentic way so you can get regular feedback. And I'm not talking about something that's cumbersome. You should decide what works for your SILC. what works best for your silk. I've had individuals that I've done this with that at the end of every agenda, or at the start of every agenda and at the end of every agenda, they do something called a fist to 5, or they do something on a scale of 0 to 5, with 0 being, I'm not happy with how things have been running, or I'm not happy with the level of communication and trust, or I don't think we're aligning with our expectations we agreed upon. And a 5 being, we are nailing it. It's a slam dunk. We're doing the best we can do, the best possible. So I've had organizations that I've worked with in different types of groups like SILCs, where they just do that at the beginning or end of a meeting, or both, to get a sense of kind of where people are at. That's data collection. But you can also do surveys through SurveyMonkey. You can just have an ongoing survey system set up. But it's important to have some type of data so you can make database decisions, both about membership, effectiveness of membership, engaging members, but also with your other outcomes. So it's really important that you have good data, and that you have so you can have collective database decisions. It's also important that you share that data with everyone. That increases the transparency, increases trust. And by collecting good data, it allows you to also really see who you're missing collectively on your SILC and with regard to stakeholder collaboration. So those are some important things you can do to kind of get started. And I realize this is a lot of information to share in an hour. And many of you may already be doing many of the things I described. But what we found through our work at the Kansas Institute for Positive, Healthy, Inclusive Communities is often, actually almost always, organizations are not intentional enough around the things I described today. And those can result in long-term unresolved issues, which get in the way of organization systems and SILCs in doing their jobs and being as effective as they could be. So if you would like additional information on this, you can certainly email me at matt@kific.org. My email is on the slides, or you can check out our website at www.kific.org. And I'd be happy to set up a time to talk to you more about this or answer any additional questions. I know we just have a couple minutes left, but any general comments or questions?
So this is Brooke. I have dropped the survey or the evaluation into the chat. I did want to highlight real quick, someone from the Montana SILC stated they are developing a member leadership and training inventory spreadsheet. The leadership section asks members to self-report skills and strengths. For example, effective communicator, preparing reports, grant writing, public speaking, hobbies, organizational connections, etc. And the training section has clickable links to trainings, some required and some specific to certain communities. This tool will provide a way to see who does or likes what, who has knowledge in certain subjects, and the tool may show where training is needed. That sounds fabulous, and maybe you could share it. So. And then someone said, this has been great. It gave me lots of ideas on how to proceed going forward. Perfect timing as our annual training is coming up next month. Thanks, Matt. Very helpful for me to learn as a new employee of the Washington SILC. Thank you for your time. So if anybody dropped a question and we didn't get to it, we will send those to Matt. He will answer them via email, and then we'll post them on the website. But at this time, I don't see any.
Great. Thank you, everybody.